that they miss will be what undoes them from the inside out. So we make it a really big focus, or myself at least, with the space that my role allows me to have those conversations and create that space. People can do this work without compromising their mental health, their physical health, their well-being, thing that might impact their kind of daily experience of work in what is a really difficult industry. And that has a flow-on effect across externally as well, because if you have a happy team, they're going to talk positively about us, they're going to talk positively about the work, and people see that and they connect to it.
Awesome. I mean, I think you saying that is perfect, because I've understood and like that has been happening throughout the industry too, and I think you're absolutely right. And I mean, it's funny because what you're saying and what I think is great, because I could see it from talking to you previously and everything, that's something that you're really striving for with Ultimerse. But then we hear in the news and everything about these other companies just falling apart, and if you really to boil it down to it, really came down to those three things that you mentioned, if you had to just focus on three things. So I think those are really awesome points, and just how important it is to have those things to be a part of like what standing out is. And what's funny too is we never hear about these things until they become issues. So it's like you're standing out, but you're not necessarily standing out in the forefront where, you know, of your fans or anything like that. You're standing them out. You're standing out like, I can't even think of a good analogy here, but you're not necessarily on the forefront, but you're standing out as a company, and how you're moving forward with things, because you're doing something different, and that's like true to you and staying healthy. And when I say you, as like, you know, a company, as an entity, as a team.
Yes.
So all really cool stuff. So yeah, thank you for providing your insight on that, because I thought it was kind of a good way to kind of like look at standing out from a different perspective, and you gave a really good example of what that looks like for the indie
thank you
devs.
for asking about it. Doesn't happen a lot that those conversations start, so it's really positive that we're starting to see more and more of them across the industry.
Yeah, definitely. No, thank you, and no problem. All right, so we kind of got a good idea of you know, what we can kind of determine or differentiate what standout means. But let's take this in a little bit different direction. So part of standing out obviously is going to involve having funding. And so, as we all know, funding can always be a difficult subject. It could be a difficult obstacle. And as far as Ultimerse is concerned, you guys are in somewhat of a different position than most indie teams, as you would have. Well, actually, I'm just going to if you don't mind sharing, you know, how is it that Ultimerse is a little bit different than what typically indie teams would be for their funding situations? Because I'm guessing that a large majority of people are kind of bootstrapping, and not to say that you guys aren't in a lot of different ways, but what is essentially that you're doing that differs, and what are some other like funding? Let's just cover the basics too, as far as what indie devs are doing to get funding, and how there are benefits and not benefits to those types of funding.
Yeah, definitely. We are in a really fortunate position in this industry, and especially in an industry in a country like Australia, where we are a little bit further away from the rest of the world, and
Yeah.
we also have some challenges technologically when it comes to internet speeds and all things that can really affect development. But we're lucky in that we have two investors who are deeply committed to games and the industry in general, and they recognise that the sort of investment you need to put in for games is huge for any indie. I think there's a real problem with people being taught that games is a huge risk. Going into the games industry and working in these businesses, and the reason why we see so many businesses start and fail is because there is a very large chance that if you misstep somewhere within your marketing, within your process, within your production pipeline, you won't make any money and you won't be able to survive. So we are really blessed that a lot of the financial risks are reduced for us, and we have a little bit more freedom to really think about what moves we want to make, which other indies don't always have that chance. We're also lucky in Victoria especially in that with Creative and Film Victoria. So we have a lot of government support, and that's made a huge difference. And there's a reason why Melbourne has become a hub for this sort of content in Australia, because there is a lot of support there. And not only from funding, but just for giving the space to have those conversations about where they can support, where they can signal boost. It's really incredible. For the broader scene, the big for me is I have huge respect for solo indie devs. There are a couple that I really, really admire. There's a guy called Mike Blackney. He's working on a game called Dead Static Drive, which is gorgeous. And there's a young man in New Zealand, Seth, who's working on a game called Nycra, and they are both working completely tirelessly across all aspects of these games. To be a solo dev is such a labour of love. And on the flip side, the industry is really supportive, and we try and take care of each other where we can. But there is, having to work on something that you love so much against all the pressures of normal life, financial responsibilities, that's when you have to look into these really different options, whether that's, crowdfunding or, investing a lot of your own money, which a lot of devs have to do.
No, keep going.
Yeah, so the thing with crowdfunding, I think we've seen a big rise in that, but I think it is starting to settle now because now crowdfunding is getting quite saturated. I think it can be a really good option, but you do need to get your marketing pin perfect. And if you're doing something really experimental that's hard to communicate, or you're not sure how to communicate it, there's almost no guarantee that the audience you want is going to latch enough to want to put the money in, especially when a lot of people through early access or funding have been burnt now. It's a lot harder to create that trust. So it really does depend on the game and cultivating that community and getting the timing right, I think. And then, there is always the option for indies to have conversations with publishers, which presents totally different challenges, timing and what market you're aiming for and what platform. And you really only get one chance to put the right pitch forward. So you have to be airtight in your approach to it. There's a great GDC talk, I think from a couple of years ago, maybe even last year, that talks about the 30 mistakes in your indie game pitch and the things that, so many devs go in being like, yeah, this is the thing that makes my game different and perfect. And it's like they've heard that 1,000 times. So you have to be really, really clever in your approach.
Yeah, definitely. Because, that's the thing. You can't it's funny because there's a lot of things that will work and they'll always work. But if your approach is static and stagnant and essentially the same as everybody else's, it's not going to be different. But look at Nintendo. Like there's so many things that they're innovative, but they're also very consistent in a lot of different ways, but their approach each way is slightly different to certain things. I guess like Mario Kart, and Mario Party, like those are all the same things, but they each bring something a little bit different to the table. That might not be the greatest example, only because they've obviously secured a specific type of audience in which is always going for. But you can break it down to just about anything, like fast food restaurants, right? That's pretty basic. But then I just heard a podcast where these new chain of pizza fast food restaurants are opening up, and if you think like of talking about opening up a brand new fast food restaurant, people are like, no, you can't do it. But once again, and these guys, it's Mod Pizza, and a big part of the whole reason why they're destroying it out there is because they're focusing on the user experience, the customer experience. They're having empathy for their customer base. So I apologize. I digress here a little bit, but.
No, I definitely agree with you. I think you can boil it down to that sort of approach. If you are going mass market and, you go, oh, our audience is everyone. It's like, well, it never really is everyone. You can get to a point where games like Mario Kart and Mario Party appeal to a wide audience, but they often appeal to the audience that is looking for that camaraderie between their friends. So there's always something you can pull out of that approach to then feed into your investment approach as well, and where you seek money and why you're seeking it, so that you can tap into those spaces.
Yeah, definitely. And now just to quickly like go over this. So we talked about crowdfunding. You mentioned that in countries in places like Melbourne, and I believe Canada is another one where there's you can get government support. Like for any other indie devs, and I'm sure a lot of them are already aware in doing this, but what other types of like activities and like side hustles, I guess, and because on top of probably a full-time job in some cases too, that are some that our indies are doing and considering to kind of just get them buy-in and funding their game.
Yeah, so most indies that I know of, especially in Australia, are doing a lot of contract work. So whether
Mm.
that's porting across titles or creating a bespoke product, I think it's a really good option to supplement the work, you kind of quote unquote want to do. But with a small team, it can be really tough to know where to find those people, create that portfolio, and it can take a lot of time and energy, and you don't always secure the contract. Once you've started to, however, though, you can build that portfolio, it does seem to be sort of the best option for that supplemental income
Mm.
to longevity. Otherwise, there's a lot of little things you can do, but the biggest issue with all of them is just time.
Yeah.
Everything that you're doing is going to take away from development, so you have to find what works for you. But anything from asset creation, speaking opportunities at some events are paid as well. Merchandise, if there's parts of your game or specific things about your game that are really popular, peripheral consulting work, you've got to look at your team's strengths and find what you're good at and find a way to offer it. Commissions can be really good if you're solo and you want to make a little bit of extra money on the side, but again, very saturated market. So you've got to find what's unique about what you can offer. And I think if you are solo or a smaller team, it's really worth thinking about things like Patreon or Ko-fi. Coffee, I don't know how you pronounce it, but that sort of style support where it's that less full-scale crowdfunding, but more exclusive, almost personal and interpersonal support to create these smaller communities that feel like they're getting a little bit more of you or a little bit more of a behind the scenes of your process. So there's a lot of options, but it really does depend on your team and the size of it and the time you have to spend on it outside of your normal development or normal deliveries.
Cool. And I mean, this is actually a really good segue to something I was kind of curious about, Ultimerse. And I mean, like, in terms of, from your guys' perspective, I'm sure there's also like some advantages and disadvantages to how you receive your funding. So what are some of those? Because it sounds, I'm sure from a lot of outsiders' perspectives, it's like, oh, with the government support and everything, this sounds great, but I'm sure to some degree there might be some strings attached and things along those lines.
Yeah, I mean, there's always going to be advantages and disadvantages, no matter how you're funded, I think. And, when it comes to things like government funding, we are both blessed and cursed in Victoria, especially to have such a wide breadth of incredible talent and incredible titles and concepts. So the competition is fierce. You really need to get your pitches right and hope that you're not the 50 other awesome, well thought out, well delivered titles that are coming out of Melbourne all the time. So that is one disadvantage to the government fund. But it's a disadvantage that you would always take. There's a true sense of responsibility, I think. I think that applies no matter where money is coming from, but especially if it's your own. But I think when you build these relationships with your investors and you know what they're giving up or they're committing to give you an opportunity to succeed, that can be a really big weight to carry. And we're lucky that we can have really honest and open conversations with them about that responsibility. But it does mean that we want to put them in a position where we can prove their investment was worth it. There's also the understanding of the industry. Both of our investors have very, very strong business backgrounds, but even if you're working in games every single day, getting a really strong understanding of the industry is near impossible across every part of the market and where it's going to move and what's next, and always being forward thinking. You have to understand the past. So that can be tricky as well, communicating all of that and just reporting to a board of stakeholders and trying to make sure we communicate everything important without completely overloading these people who are trying to help us out. But we are very, very lucky in that we're